Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome Ben? Second of our guests, and I'm going to invite them to come and join me here at the front, if that's okay, is Dr. Khalid Dawas. And last but not least, Dr. Tiziana Roggio. So in this next little part of our time together, each of the speakers will introduce themselves and some of their work. I'm going to be the timekeeper, so I'll make sure that they stick to time. Once we've heard from all three of them, they will form a panel and be very happy to take questions. So first of all, let's hear from Ben. Would you like to come to the mic?
Thank you very much for coming tonight. My name is Ben DePere. I'm the executive producer of this film. I run a company called Basement Films. I used to be the editor of Channel 4 News for 10 years. We were commissioned by the BBC to make this film, first by Panorama in March, April of 2024. We worked with Panorama for about 10 weeks, and they were very keen on the story, but then they spoke to the bosses at the top of the BBC and said they had to speak to them, and then the next day they dropped the story, saying that they had to do stories about the election that was upcoming, which was a bit of a shock to us. We then took it to BBC Worldwide, which is part of BBC World Service, which is a strand called BBC I, which is an investigative strand. We worked with them for 6 months, and we had a team of 4 Palestinians on the ground, gathering testimony from doctors and filming in the hospitals that you've just seen in the film. And then it was meant to go out in January this year, 2025, and then we were told it would be delayed because they were running another film called, I can't remember what it was called, but it was controversial because it omitted the fact that one of the 14-year-old boys who was narrating the film, his father was a Hamas minister. I mean, he wasn't a Hamas militant, he was actually a British-trained agriculturist, and Palestinian based in London described to me as, well, Benny was literally head of fruit and veg. But because they omitted that fact from the film was withdrawn, it became a huge controversy, the government got involved, the head of the BBC said it was a disgrace, and then they then delayed our film for a week, and then 2 weeks, and then 3 weeks, and they went on for 10 weeks, and we knew that they were delaying it because of the controversy around the other film, and we were saying, look, there's nothing wrong with our film. It had been approved by the BBC. Most of the news bosses had approved it and said it was the most important film they would put on this year. But in the end, they got us in a room and said, we need to dismantle the film, and it's an hour long. It needs to be no more than 5 minutes or 10 minutes long. And so at that point, we went public, myself and Ramita, and criticised the BBC. They gave us back the film. We threatened legal action. They gave us back the film to distribute internationally, and then we said we wanted it to run on British television because we thought it would be paid for by the license fee. And in the end, they sent me a gagging clause which we had to sign, which was we had to deny that the BBC had ever commissioned or made the film, firstly, and secondly, that they had ever not wanted to run it. So we refused to do that. We went public again. They gave us back the film, and it ran on Channel 4. So it had a controversy, which it never needed to have, but it did highlight the fact that the British media, and especially the BBC, I've said that I used to be the editor of Channel 4 News. I think Channel 4 News has been quite good through the what people are calling a genocide, and will legally be called a genocide if there's ever a case. But I think it really highlighted the fact that these stories are not being told. You can watch them on Instagram, you can watch them on social media, but you can't watch them on mainstream television. And there are exceptions to that. There are films that come out, there are pieces that come out. This is happening every day. This film was completed in May, it went out in June, but the attacks, if anything, have intensified. A lot of the hospitals you saw in the north that were destroyed were reoccupied by Palestinians and reopened by Palestinian doctors and by doctors you see here, volunteer doctors. But the whole wave is happening again. They're clearing the north. Hospitals in the north have been surrounded and bombed in the last 3 or 4 weeks, and they're desperately trying to get these hospitals to evacuate to go south again because they want the whole population to move south. I got very little else to add. It's always humbling being on a panel with doctors who've actually risked their lives to go into Gaza. So I should really introduce these guys, and they should tell you their stories. Thank you.
So on Christmas Day 2023, I was standing on the beach in Al Arish, which is a city in Sinai on the Mediterranean coast. And I was straining my eyes to see, looking east to see if I could see Gaza. Gaza's 40 kilometers away. I was never going to see it. But I was desperate to see and to get there. And in fact, on the next day, after being held in Egypt for a day, we were allowed into Gaza with a huge sense of relief, because like many people I meet, and maybe perhaps many people here, I was desperate to do something. Our collective incapacity to stop what was going on was really taking its toll. My name is Khalid Dawas. I'm a surgeon. I work in London, in University College London, and I volunteered with a group or an organization called Medical Aid for Palestinians, but I also chaired for 8 years a charity called the Hanoun Foundation, which works with medical schools in Palestine, and I'm now vice chair. And I'll tell you the story of my trip through their eyes, but also what I noticed in my observations. And there are certain dates that stick in my mind, like they do in all our minds. And I remember very clearly the 1st of January 2024. So this is barely a week into our stay in Gaza. And that acronym that became very famous, Wounded Child with No Surviving Family, became very alive to me on that day. Because on that day, when I was walking with my colleagues from MAP, Medical Aid for Palestinians, we spotted 3 children, 2 who were on the floor in the waiting area, and 1 who was sitting on the single bed in the resuscitation area, and he was ventilated and had some gauze wrapped around his forehead. That boy, whose name I still don't know, died because he had a head injury with some shrapnel going through his skull. But we didn't know that at that point. We had to move the 2 children who were sitting in the waiting area because one of them was unconscious and was hardly responding to anything. And we found a hole in his chest. And we discovered he had a big bit of his chest that had been blown away by some shrapnel. So we thought we would do the right thing, which is there are special things we did, put a chest drain in, try and sort that out. But in fact, he didn't respond. He had a head injury as well, and he died. He was 5 years old, and his name was Ala. And his sister was the girl on the floor whose leg was broken. And her name was Aya. And she was 7. She was awake, and I spoke to her. And we had to straighten her broken leg without any anesthetic. We've all heard these stories, but they really became alive when I saw this and experienced it myself. We only found out their names because their distant relatives came in about half an hour later to tell us that their parents had been killed. And like many others, they were the victims of a shelling of a shelter, which is usually a school invariably, and these are the only people remaining alive from that particular incident. So and I have a photograph of that episode, which I took illicitly because we were meant not to take photographs, really to maintain dignity, but I thought I really had to capture this moment, and I still have that photograph, and it bothers me every time I project it, but I do project it because I think it's important to show what we saw. On the 6th of January, a few days later, that hospital was hit by probably a tank missile. It went through the wall, it ended up in the window of the intensive care unit, and we had to leave. We were told it was unsafe. So we left. Now, Gazans know or knew what was going on. They told us from the moment we arrived, this is about displacement, this is about erasure, this is about our removal from the land of Gaza. They knew this, but I didn't believe it because I thought that was just fantastical. But now we see it is actually, that is the objective. And they saw this because this had happened before. They knew the stories of even going back to 1948 when Israel was established. If you go down from Jerusalem down to the coastline, it's a beautiful landscape full of pine trees. Now these pine trees were planted after 1948. And they were planted partly to make it pretty, but also to conceal some of the villages like Lifta and Kalayun and Sarah. These are villages that are in the foothills of Jerusalem where there are remnants, but they're covered by pine trees, so it's very difficult to find out where they are. And also, it's interesting that even the names of the military corridors that are now established in Gaza, there's Netzarim, there's Morag, there's Eretz, these are all names of settlements that used to exist in Gaza until they were forcibly evacuated in 2005. Now in April, we went back again with MAP to Gaza, and on the 1st of April, we were again stuck in Al Arish because we were held back for 2 days. We were told there was a problem with our insurance. But a few days later, we discovered why actually we were held back, because that is the day that the World Central Kitchen staff convoy was attacked just outside the hospital we were based at in Deir al-Balah, which is in the center of Gaza. 7 people were killed. And I met Hosai, who is the young 21-year-old man who used to be a farmer, now works in the mortuary and wraps bodies. And I met him when I was in the hospital. He told me he wrapped the bodies of those 7 people after that attack on the convoy. And then the 12th of April, again, in my mind, again, the same picture again. This became the repeated storyline of our time in Gaza. I get a call with my colleagues at 7 a.m. Someone walked into our room. I need your help. And again, 3 victims, invariably children, in a school. The shelter is hit, and they were the ones surviving. But actually only one of those survived, because the girl who I operated on and embarrassingly couldn't really help died eventually because we couldn't find the source of her bleeding. She had 2 operations in 2 hours. We still couldn't find the source of her bleeding. And that became really the narrative. So we talk about Gaza, but then 6 weeks later, I was in the West Bank. And in the West Bank, I went to Jenin, which is a town in the north of the West Bank, which mirrors very much what happens in Gaza, but on a smaller scale. And in Jenin, we went to the ambulance center, which is run by the Palestinian Red Crescent Society. And they showed us an ambulance, which is still functioning, in fact, 2 or 3 ambulances in their garage with bullet holes in them. The bullet holes were not aimed at the wheels, they were not aimed at the engine, they were aimed at the door of the passenger or where the patients would be. So these bullet holes were aimed to kill. They were not decided there to disable the car. We saw several of those. I met the paramedic who was also involved in one of those incidents and was burnt in his own ambulance. And he's still scarred. He still works, but he's scarred very heavily. Now we tell these stories, and we look at the film, and the film is a very difficult watch. I've seen it several times. But even then, I sit in the back, and so I have to sort of bow down and cover my face every so often with some of the scenes that I see, because they are difficult. And though I don't know the people in there directly, but I know a couple of them indirectly. So Khalid al-Sir, who is the man who came back from prison and was hugging his dad at the end, his brother was one of our trainees who we sponsored through the Hanun Foundation. Many years ago, his brother now is a surgeon in the US. When we're in touch with him, and of course you can imagine the despair he's going through. Hamdan, who is the paramedic who was photographed at the end, who disappeared, his sister is actually here in the UK, and she's one of the 2 families that were brought to the UK about 5 months ago for treatment of their children. And I didn't realize that she was his sister, but she told me that that's her brother. So it really is, it makes it very alive and very personal. Anita, thank you very much for hosting us. Thank you for humanity. Thank you for your faith. And thank you for being here.
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Tiziana Roggen. I'm a consultant plastic surgeon. I work in London at St. George's Hospital. So earlier this year, in May and June, I traveled with some of my colleagues for the first time into Gaza as a volunteer with the English charity Ideals. I was based in Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, which is in the south of Gaza, and we are working alongside extraordinary local doctors, nurses, and other members of staff. As you've just seen in the film, situation is quite overwhelming there in Gaza. But whilst I was there, standing in the operating theater, what was just shocking me the most was the resilience and the dignity of the medical teams and the patients, and especially patient conditions and stories. The hospital was, as you can imagine, under immense strain, and resources were very limited. At times we were running out of the very basic items such as gauzes or the antiseptic solution that we use to to prep the skin before operating patients. We had often to operate with very little or no analgesia, so obviously we didn't have all the equipment and instruments that we used to, that we have available here. The choice of antibiotics was really restricted as well, and I always remember the sound of children screaming in the recovery room after surgery because we just didn't have the medication to ease their pain. So yes, children, because half of our surgical list every day, we were operating about 10, 11 patients a day. Half of the list was just populated by children, most of them under the age of 7. And what was shocking and heartbreaking, on top of just treating people that were absolutely devastated by blast injuries, burns, and they were children, the most shocking thing was hearing their stories. Most of them were orphans, or they only had one survivor in their family. And one memory that stays with me amongst all the others, unfortunately, is one day we had this 5-year-old little girl showing up into the hospital with a burn on her shoulder, and when she was asked who she was with, she was alone. She had no one else. I mean, for me, coming from a background, I work here in London. It's a background where I'm used to work with in a well-resourced hospital. It was just humbling and obviously unbearable sometimes to see the conditions these people were. But yet the local staff never stopped. They improvised, they supported each other, they turned up to work every day with dignity. And it was absolutely heartbreaking because their family had been killed. Some of them lost members of their family whilst they were at work with us. All of them had been displaced multiple times. They had to leave their houses were destroyed, and every time they were moving from one place to the other, they were losing even more. They were living in tents that we have seen many times, and where everything was lacking. There was no sanitation, no water, no food. We had to carry the food with us from London because there was nothing in there. And yet people were asking me if it was true that there was no food in Gaza when I came back. They just carried on because they had no choice. This time there reminded me that we as surgeons and as human beings, we have the responsibility to stand with colleagues working in this difficult situation, and also with patients who deserve the same right to care and healing as anyone else. I would like to thank the charity Ideals for giving me the chance to go there, and all of you here tonight for coming, bearing witness, and supporting this cause. Because what is happening in Gaza is not just a medical crisis, it's a humanitarian crisis, and every act of solidarity, every gesture of support, donation, and every voice raised makes a difference, especially for all my Palestinian colleagues. Thank you very much.
We're hugely grateful to all three of our speakers, and we have a few minutes to have some questions. If you would like to ask any questions, I'm going to ask Anita to go one way and Amira to go the other way with microphones. And if you'd like to raise your hand, and if I could please ask just for protocols, if you could keep your questions short, and I can encourage the panelists to keep their replies reasonably short, just so that we can have as many questions as we're able.
I'll do my best, but I'm a lawyer. I'm a bit prolix sometimes. I've been an international lawyer for over 40-odd years, including in the UN and the Foreign Office. The key case is the genocide case. International and national criminal law play a very small part in enforcing international humanitarian law, mainly because you can't get hold of the people. And the important thing about the genocide case is it's a very, very high bar, but it's the kind of case in which you can force Israel into the international court. It's unthinkable.
Can you please get to your question?
Yeah, well, I'm trying to. Okay. So essentially, congratulations on that film. In itself, it is an encapsulation. It's cogent evidence of genocide. The key will be, and the question is, to what degree is it happening to hospitals in central and southern Gaza as well, because that will really be cogent evidence of genocide. And how is evidence being gathered in a way that can be brought before a court? There are people who specialize in helping journalists and others gather that evidence in a way that's usable in court.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for the question. I would say that my career, I've covered many human rights atrocities on different scales. There's never been anything like this. The first one that I covered that was similar to this was the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War in 2009, when essentially the Sri Lankan army shoved the Tamils up into a far corner of the island, and which they called the no-fire zone, and then they killed as many as they could until they thought they'd defeated the Tamil tigers. This is on a different scale, and I mention that because that was the advent of people having mobile phones that could film things like that. And the Sri Lankan soldiers filmed their own atrocities and then shared the videos, and we got the videos, and it was proof of genocide. Now everyone has a phone that can film their own genocide, their own atrocities. So when you say, what is the evidence of genocide? There are, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of videos that have been posted on social media. There is data that has been collected by the Israelis themselves, by satellite. There is a British military plane that is flying from Cyprus on an almost daily basis that is supposedly using specialized equipment to find the hostages, but it is believed that the data that this plane collects is filming everything, and so the British have it. The evidence is absolutely overwhelming because you're a lawyer. One of the things you need to prove a genocide case is intent, and Israeli politicians are openly saying they want to cleanse. They're using purge, cleanse. They want to resettle Gaza. I'm talking, and this is another thing the British media is omitting. They're not showing these politicians saying this because quite often they're saying, well, these are just extremists. They're not extremists. They are the defense minister, Smotrich, who is I don't know what he is. They are cabinet ministers. The finance minister, yes, and the interior minister. And they are openly saying genocidal things. And if you watch the Israeli media, which I've made another film about the Israeli media, it is sort of open season. We need to clean out the Arabs. We don't care how many killed. Everyone's guilty. So I think the evidence is absolutely overwhelming and irrefutable if you get it into a court. But that's a different thing, because it was 2 years ago almost since the South Africans took the case at the Hague, and the Israelis managed to delay the second hearing, which was meant to be 6 months on, and the third hearing, which was a year. So the second hearing on this, because the case they brought was, is there a case for genocide? And the judges voted 14-1 that there was. The next hearing will be 2 years after the first hearing, during which this has all continued non-stop.
That was actually only on interim measures. There's no decision yet at all on merits, but there will be. There's overwhelming evidence that 17 states have intervened. Nicaragua's brought a separate case against Germany. So I've gone from very sceptical to thinking there is actually going to be a primary genocide, which will have
which will have grave consequences, but it doesn't really help anyone at the moment.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed, Ben. Another question.
Khalil Youssef, I was the Liberal Democrat candidate for Parliament in this area last year. Can I just very quickly say that Tiziana, Khalid, Ben and your team, I'm absolutely in awe of your sacrifice and your courage and your humanity. You know, what you are doing is an indelible part of history, and it's an honor to hear you speak today. My question is about the media. This is a really powerful film, and we've all learned a great deal as a result of it. What contribution do you think the media has played, and what contribution should it play in order to bring about justice for so many tens of thousands of innocent victims, both Israeli and Palestinian?
I think the media has played a poor role in this. I was based in Israel and Palestine for substantial parts of my career when I was a producer, and the last conflict I covered in Gaza involved the deaths of 1,400 people, including 500 children, and the media coverage was absolutely overwhelming. It was lead story every night, and people were discussing how disgusting it was to see 500 children die, civilians, in such a small space. There's now 20,000 children at least who've been killed, and it's very rare now that it's at the top of a bulletin or that you see the graphic pictures. And I think the media's role has been disgraceful. I think it's been, in some ways, the end of journalism. I think the BBC particularly has mirrored the government. The government has been a disgrace. They have tiptoed along a line where they try to condemn the worst atrocities, but they don't. You know, we are signatories of the Genocide Convention, which means that we should be compelled not only to stop a genocide if we can, but not to aid it. This government is aiding the genocide because we're still selling the arms to the Israelis that mean the F-35s can fly. We are still not condemning them like we should. We still not put any other sanctions on them, and the government is denying. It's tiptoeing a very weird line. Its own internal advice from the Foreign Office, and the trade whatever you call it, trade department, that internally lawyers are saying this is a genocide, you need to do something, and the government is trying to say it's not. So I think that I'm not condemning all the media, I'm not condemning all of the BBC, but the tone of the coverage has been cowardly. There is, I would estimate, that there are many tens more people being killed in Gaza, and everyone can see every single death almost because everyone's filming everything, and the media is completely out of kilter with what's happening there.
Lovely, thank you very much, Ben. Another question, Anita's coming to you.
Hi. I want to know what is happening to all these orphan children.
Sounds like a medical question.
The question was, what's happened to the orphan children?
To the orphan children.
Well, we don't really know how many of them there are. There are estimates of 20,000. At the beginning of all this, I remember talking to my dad, who was watching the news second by second, and he said to me the same things to me. One of the big problems, one of the big disasters, tragedies we're going to get out of this is the number of orphans and what's going to happen to them. Now, in Gaza, traditionally, and I say traditionally because there have been so many wars on Gaza, there have been so many deaths, there were so many orphans, that it's become part of normal existence that you have to think about what you're going to do with orphans whose parents have been killed. And traditionally, they get looked after by extended family. The idea of adoption, for example, doesn't really exist because they tend to go to family. But no more and more, the idea of what's going to happen with adoption is coming up. I get asked by friends of mine and colleagues who haven't been there, who say, well, can I help? I don't know really, because you can't get anybody out of Gaza at the moment anyway. So the concept of having adoption from outside doesn't exist at the moment. One of the interesting stories, again, tragically, I heard very early on, and we were trying to find that information when I was in Gaza in April of 24, was a story of neonates, babies who were taken out of their incubators and taken to Cairo because their parents had been killed. And nobody had any idea who their families were because they were separated. So, and I can't tell you that I've verified this for sure, because there's no way of doing so, but I was asked, can I help trying to identify family members of 20 neonates who were in Cairo? Now, how do you start identifying the parents or the family of those kind of children? So it gives you an idea of the scale of the tragedy. I don't think we are able to cope with that at the moment, and that's something that's going to come and probably haunt us later on. And I imagine the vast majority of those orphans within Gaza who are older will probably be absorbed by their extended families, but their extended families are all shocked and impoverished and have no homes. So it's a problem which is so immense that I don't even think about it, because I can't find a solution.
Thank you very much indeed. Can you wait for the microphone, please, just so that people can hear?
Can I just ask you, as I understood it, that Gaza was a concentration camp, 3-4 years ago, a concentration camp, and not even a cat could get into it, and that there were 1 million people living in this concentration camp. 20,000 seems a very, very tiny, small percentage if you think about how many children we are to parents, as it were. The numbers are just so disproportionate, aren't they? How many of them have been killed?
You make a good point, and I think we go, because people question the data all the time. In fact, usually the question usually is, the numbers are too big. This is no way. Of course, the Israelis always refute it and say, well, no, of course not. The vast majority of these are Hamas fighters, and we haven't killed half as many as those. But even if you assume half the numbers, the still numbers are pretty big for any civilian population. The population of Gaza is 2.5 million. It's been besieged since 2007. Before that, it was still besieged, but that didn't have a fence. So Gaza has always been besieged, because after 1967, when the Israelis took over Gaza, the West Bank, Golan Heights, and Sinai, they became military camps. And I know that because I went there in those days, and I remember the crossing, but it wasn't a wall. So 20,000 is a small number. When people ask me about the number of those killed in Gaza, and we talk about 60,000 at the moment, I do not believe that for 1 second. I don't know a single person in Gaza who has not lost at least 5 members of the family. And I think we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, but there's no one that can prove it. And of course, the figures which come out of Gaza, we have to say the Hamas-run Ministry of Health, because that's what the BBC tells us that these numbers are 60,000, but they can't keep a count. They don't know who's under the rubble. They only get told of people who've been killed by their families when they report them. So if nobody reports anything, the numbers don't get counted. So actually, we know for sure these numbers are an underestimate.
Thank you very much. Other questions, please? There's one over there and then one over here.
Thank you very much to all the panel for sharing your insights this evening. My question is, there's always been proxy wars in Gaza and Israel. As you say, I think going back to 1948 and the foundation of the Palestinian state. What distinguishes this one from all of the others, and what is going to make it that conflict stop?
So what's the last part of the question?
What's going to make the conflict stop?
Who wants to take this one? What makes it different? I don't think the only difference this time round really is that the language used by the occupiers is out there. It's frank, it's overt, there is no subtlety about it. Whereas in the past, we, including me, and I remember at university being involved in this kind of politics and people not believing what I said and what we described was going on in Palestine and Israel, because they said it was too fantastical. There's no way a state like Israel would do this to anybody, particularly with their history. So what's happened this time around is that there's no camouflage. You see it as I think many of us have been hoping for many years people would see it. This is the reality of life for Palestinians. And like I say, the West Bank is not much better than Gaza. It just happens to be a smaller volume, lower tone of attacks, but it's been happening for decades. And if you remember in Gaza particularly, Gaza's gone through wars in 2008, 2012, 2014, and 2014 was supposed to be big, but there was nothing compared to this one. And then you've got 220, 221, 222 several times, and then finally 223. This is, I think the difference here is that this culmination, has given the Israeli far right, which unfortunately does have a big majority in Israel, the excuse to go in and do what they wanted, which is to clean out the land and claim the whole historical land of Palestine as their own. They don't want Gaza, they want the West Bank, really. West Bank is what they really want, because that's where the biblical sites that they wish to be their own, that's where they exist. So this is what's going to happen, that's what's going to be played out in front of us, I think, over the next couple of years, at least. How this is going to be resolved, I always have to take myself out of my body and think what I would be thinking if I was looking back at this in 200 years' time. A resolution to anything like this really is by coexistence. But are the people involved in this ready for coexistence? I would have said maybe 2 years ago, I think there was some preparedness for that, maybe on both sides. I don't see that happening at the moment, because I can't see any Palestinian at the moment thinking, how can I exist with a nation that is out to destroy me in such an overt way? It's very difficult. But really the solution we know is going to be coexistence. But what's happened now has pushed that back a long way back. And for coexistence, you need some balance of power. The balance of power, the power at the moment is so one-sided, particularly with the unlimited support that Israel gets from certain quarters, US in particular, that it becomes very difficult to see a just solution. And you need justice for there to be a resolution. How can we get justice in the current circumstances?
Lady here on the second row. Anita will come to you.
Hi. I feel like I'm not sure how to say this, but you mentioned how, and this is like curiosity, so sorry. You mentioned about like Israel being really open, and this is like the first time we're seeing it, like, you know, they're not apologizing. But whilst you were there, is it clear, like, so like people are being accused of being Hamas, but like, is it clear, like, are people also open about who is Hamas? Do you like see Hamas in, like, I don't know if this makes sense, but like, is there any kind of clarity of like, okay, these people, they've got a plan, like, you know, there's going to be some comeback, or is it just, you know, all the rumors of things being under hospitals, it's just like, well, where are they? Like, what are they doing? Are they gonna fight? I don't know. Like, this is a stupid question, but do you know what I mean? Like,
No, I think I understand. Yeah. Shall I? Yeah. So Hamas in countries in the West, UK, US, EU, seen as a terrorist organization, and we're not allowed to talk about them. In other places around the world, the majority of the world, they're seen as a party, a political party with an armed wing, which happens to be also called a resistance wing. So there's a very different view about Hamas. When you're in Gaza, you don't see soldiers or fighters walking around the streets with guns and Kalashnikovs. That doesn't exist. But Hamas as a party, which is how they started off, exists as a political power. And they won elections in 2005, and they were supposed to run both Gaza and the West Bank. Then there was we'll call it a civil war in Gaza. They managed to defeat Fatah, which is the other party, which is what the president belongs to, and they took over Gaza. And that's when the schism happened in Palestinian politics. But walking around, there's no way of saying this person is Hamas as a supporter or not. I mean, they'll tell you when you ask them, because I think people are fairly open about it. But Hamas doesn't mean that they're fighters. They don't carry weapons. The vast majority of them are employed by a government which is run by Hamas. In the same way that in the West Bank, it's run by Fatah, which is aligned to the Palestinian Authority. And there's a lot of support for the political views of Hamas in the Middle East and probably around the world, because they see that as a resistance movement, and they see that it is the right of Palestinians to resist their occupation. So when Israel or anybody else says, well, we need to destroy Hamas, well, you can destroy Hamas if you like, but the concept of having a resistance to the occupier will persist forever. So that will never go away. And of course, because it never goes away, there will always be an excuse for the Israelis to say, well, Hamas is gone, but there's another group called something else, which we're going to destroy because now they're the new terrorists. And already you can see they're talking about Mahmoud Abbas, the president, and his authority as being unfit to govern Gaza. Well, then who else is going to fit? I mean, they try to encourage now these new militant groups which are seen as traitors within Gaza to take over. But the whole idea of that is divide and conquer. There's no doubt about it.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm conscious of the time, and there's really only time for one more question. Gentleman at the back.
Hello, yeah, I'm from, my name's Mahmood Khan, I'm from Islamabad in Tilford. So just basically wanted to say that, and I suppose it's probably more a question towards the media side of things, how do we, as activists and as members of the public, how do we navigate this sort of very awkward, I mean, the lady asked about Hamas, and it's not clear cut about what, to what extent they are proscribed in this country. But to what extent can we in the media and activists and just general public, how do we navigate this sort of chilling effect of being accused of anti-Semitism when we're critical of Israel? Because I think that if I say, that there are pro-Israeli or pro-Zionist, sort of elements in the media, and in terms of the editorial side of the media, I think that's been documented. But if I say it, certain people are going to say I'm being anti-Semitic. So I just wanted your view on that. And just also to say that a bit of a name drop. I mean, people like Kareem Khan, who are members of our community. He's actually he used to be my tennis partner back in the day when we were kids. But basically, and he's married. He's the uncle of my ex-partner, ex-wife. But that's another story. But anyway, but the point is, even he is being accused of sort of being anti-Semitic, and obviously there's a whole campaign against him in the ICC. So, how do we as members of the public and activists navigate this very treacherous sort of, narrative?
It's a very good question. And what happened when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party was he didn't take action on a few idiots in the party, and Mark Regev, who was the ambassador for Israel at the time, played a sort of masterful campaign, and they moved the line of anti-Semitism over here so that it became criticism of Israel was anti-Semitism. I think that can be abandoned now. I think if you use common sense and if you point out what Israel has done as a government, you don't have to worry about anti-Semitism now, because the worst enemies of the Israeli people and of the Jewish people, and I say that as a Christian and as not a Jewish person, but I say this from having lots of Jewish friends, the worst enemies of the Jewish people at the moment are the people who are running Israel, because that is not a reflection. and I've thought long and hard about this, because when I was editor of Channel 4 News, quite often the calls I would get from the ambassador or people like that was, well, it started 3 or 4 years ago, but before it was never, they would never engage in that sort of rhetoric that criticism of Israel was anti-Semitic. You could throw it back in their faces. And I think part of the problem with the coverage now is that there's a new generation of people in newsrooms who were brought up, if they did foreign news, covering ISIS and covering the attacks in Europe when there was a fear of Islamists. And Israel has very successfully labelled Hamas as an Islamist terrorist organisation. Of course, the attacks on October the 7th were terrible. They can be analysed, but the attacks since October the 7th are off the scale. I mean, they're 100 times what those attacks were. And part of the problem that the BBC has had is giving a false equivalence to both sides, as if it's been a political campaign. Like during an election, Ofcom requires you to cover the Labour Party as much as you cover the Conservative Party. And for the BBC, for about a year and a half after October the 7th, they treated it like it was October the 8th, i.e. that lots of people had died in Israel, lots of people had died in Israel, in Gaza, and it went beyond all of that. But I do think the fear of anti-Semitism should be dropped. It's a very easy argument to win now. You just have to look at the facts of what's happened. That doesn't criticizing Israel and its actions and a genocide is not being anti-Semitic. It is actually aiding Israel, because Israel, when this ends, Israel will find itself a pariah state for decades. And it is not in its interest to be doing this. And the people who are doing it, and there may be deep psychological reasons that go back to the Holocaust and beyond. There's a line from Auden, which is I can't remember, it's that those to whom evil is done do evil in return. It's just a cyclical thing. Hamas did evil in Israel because evil had been done to them, and so on and so forth. But I think the slur of anti-Semitism, you just need to drop, because if anything, the coverage and the framing of this war in the mainstream media has really been a result of Islamophobia.
Very conscious that we're coming into land, and I'd like to say a huge thank you to you for your questions and for the interest that you have in the issue we're exploring together tonight. But on your behalf, very specially, to say to our special guests, thank you so very, very much for coming. So as we draw things to a close this evening, you may be going away with wondering, what can I do? Obviously, we can be more informed, and there's some information on the slide that gives an indication as to how we can be informed. You may wish to think about donating and giving money, contributing in different ways to these causes, and I'm sure that would be very much appreciated too. But we're going to close out with some words from children, which I hope will be a fitting place to leave us as we go our way.
After we die, will I hear your voice? When I die, will they put me in a grave with my mum and dad? When it rains, will we drown in the tent? When they bomb the tent, Will we burn? Why do they always bomb us? If they bombed someone while I was walking next to him, would I be martyred? When a missile hits us, will I feel it? When a missile hits us, do we feel pain or die immediately? I don't want to die in pieces. Will the dogs that ate the dead bodies of the martyrs turn into humans? Do children who have their legs amputated grow new legs? Why is the boy's face covered in blood? Do the Israeli pilots who bomb children have children? Every day you say that tomorrow the war will end. How many years have we been at war? I want to go to heaven because there is no fear or war and it has everything. When will we stop waiting and standing in line for fresh water and salty water? When will we go back to school? When will we have our room back and the displaced people return to their homes? When will the war end? These are some questions and statements that have come from the children of Gaza during this genocide, recorded by the Palestine Trauma Centre, UK.
As mothers, we can't fathom this. We can't imagine explaining to our children what a missile is, let alone watching them fall all around us every night. We can't imagine having to explain to our children that we have to leave our home, walk miles and miles, and go and live in a tent with only the belongings that we carry. We can't imagine explaining to them why so many people around us have lost their limbs. We can't imagine breaking the news to them that their best friend, their brother, their father, has been killed by an airstrike, starvation, or from a bullet while queuing for aid. We can't imagine not being able to feed our children, give milk to our baby, or take them to the hospital should they get ill or injured. But this is the very real reality of the 2 million people who still remain in Gaza. This pattern of bombardment, displacement, and starvation has defined life in Gaza for the past 2 years. Reports are coming out of the Gaza Strip right now saying that they are experiencing the hardest nights of the war so far, with scores of men, women, and children being killed daily as they are forced into just 3% of their land. The United Nations Commission of Inquiry has confirmed it is a genocide. In the words of Pope Leo, every human person has an inviolable dignity which must be respected and protected. On that note, we would like to thank you all for coming tonight. Dr. Rodrigo and Dr. Duas for raising awareness and sharing those very difficult stories. To Ben DePere for being part of this important documentary and for sharing the journey with us today. To Martin for making this evening run smoothly. And of course to Reverend David for opening up this beautiful space and allowing us to share this with our community. And finally, to everyone here in the audience who has taken time out of their day to be here. Let's continue to learn, amplify, and pressure our government. Thank you. And finally, if you have a phone, take a picture, because these are just a few ways of how you can support the cause. Thank you so much.
It only remains for me to say thank you so very much indeed for coming, to wish you a safe journey home, and to say we'll see you next time.